Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so honored to welcome back to the podcast Ed Calderon in order to talk about his fresh insights into the history, the origin, and the evolution of Santa Muerte and Santa Muerte veneration. And you might be asking yourselves, listeners, how did the Santa Muerte faith get to where it is today? What are the historical connections and the influences that were vital to the veneration of La Santa? What are the potential tensions between Catholics venerating Santa Muerte versus other groups venerating La Santa? Well, Ed Calderon is truly the best person to ask. Ed is, of course, no stranger to Glitch Bottle, and thousands of you have shared comments appreciating Ed sharing his personal connection and his journey to La Santa and the veneration of La Santa Muerte. And in the last episode, Ed shared about his travels, of course, to Mexico City's Tepito Barrio and sharing about the first public altar dedicated to Santa Muerte. And of course, I know many listeners, Ed really needs no introduction. He has studied the indigenous Mexican criminal culture for decades. He is incredibly proficient, and he studied the occult practices to endemic modus operandi. And it's led Ed to be recognized as one of the world's preeminent researchers in the field, not only of personal security, but also as Ed is sharing the deep history of Santa Muerte and connecting the dots. And that is what this podcast is about today. Also, I should say, Ed is the host. If you have not checked it out, we will put a link below to the Manifesto Radio podcast. And I am also very proud to support Ed on Patreon. And please, listeners, support Ed on Patreon. Check out those links below as well. In this episode of Glitch Bottle, we're so honored as always because Ed is returning to talk about his latest travels and also his latest updates into his research and the history and origin and veneration of Santa Muerte, which to me is helping preserve such an important tradition and connecting the dots and preserving it for generations to come. And with all that being said, Ed Calderon, it is so great to see you again. Thank you just so much for taking the time and stopping back on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for reading my frantic, excited discoveries that I send to you, send DM wise your way every now and then. And of course, thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience.
Oh my gosh, I know myself, Ed, and I don't want to speak for the listeners, but I am going to in this case. Are so thankful for your observations and the things that you send. Every time I get a message from you and some new insights that you have, it's wonderful. And I think, Ed, the best place to start is every time you've come on the podcast, you've helped listeners understand about Santa Muerte and the veneration. I understand that recently you have discovered some new dots to connect about the history and the influence of Santa Muerte. So can we talk about the history? What are some of the things that you've discovered?
Sure. I guess I'll start the history with my own personal history with it. The faith has always been around my family, like as far as the object or the manifestation of a figure of death that would walk behind Christ. That was the direct specific manifestation of a death iconography and death effigy that my family since I can remember would pull out during certain celebrations, would have hidden behind statues of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And most of my family were Guadalupana, so they were hardcore Catholics, basically. It wasn't what it is now. It's not something like a daily devotional or like a recognized faith practice. This was done in conjunction within Catholicism. Almost, it's like imagine many countries out there that have their own endemic or indigenous practices or ways of seeing things. I think this is probably seen the same way by the church, and in a lot of ways it was allowed. You would see ladies carrying around an effigy of death behind the reenactment of the crucifixion, for example, right? And the whole aspect of that was that death was defeated by Christ. This is where a lot of that imagery, at least for me, when I was growing up, that's where it came from. Um, there was no conversation explaining to me the rules of Santa Muerte or how you should do things. This was just something that was always there. It was kind of a hidden in plain sight, and nobody asked about it, and there was no questions because it was just a common thing. Now, fast forward a few decades, and I am in the middle of the commencement of the Mexican drug war under the Felipe Calderon administration, and now I'm a cop, right? And working in law enforcement in Mexico is a very complex thing. And it gets even way more complex once you start working your way up the ranks, and also you start getting access or getting involved in some of the higher level stuff. Um, I kind of started seeing the aspect that a lot of the people that I was working with were carrying around Santa Marta effigies, specifically in the form of black rosaries, uh, scapulario, which are like these Catholic cloth things that have the Santa Marta logos on the Santa Marta imagery on them. And finally, the small statues being carried with them in small pocket altars, either metal mint tins with the little effigy inside of it or a prayer card. Or they would take me to some of these public altars and basically say, "Hey, you have to give ask for protection." You would go to the actual church, and then you would go across the street in Tijuana to the Santa Muerte altar that's kind of hidden away. That's when I started to connect the dots as far as, oh, this thing is like an internal also faith practice, and they know about it, but this is not the Santa Muerte that I grew up with. Basically, is what I started kind of to form in my head. At the very top of the organization that I was a part of was a man named Luna, Martinez Luna, who is currently in U.S. custody under cartel charges that he was working for the cartels, apparently. When his whole debacle was going on, a lot of stuff was coming out about him, and they realized that Martinez Luna also had a giant Santa Muerte altar at his office. It kind of like clicked in my mind how this Santa Muerte faith was real spread out in different places, both on the criminal side and on the police side at high levels. One thing they both of them shared, and it's something I actually the revelation came from my friend Conejo. Conejo is a rapper, also a former, a reformed criminal who I arrested under murder charges in Tijuana. But we're friends now, so don't worry about him. He's doing great. He is a Palo practitioner, and he was a Palo practitioner during the 2000s in Tijuana. And he made the observation that both politicians and high level cartel people would go to some of these Palo or some of these Santeria rituals. Like there was no good or bad in these places. Like everybody went because everybody was worried or wanted for themselves some sort of protection or supernatural power. And they had a faith that these things worked. Um, it became apparent to me that a lot of the practice as I've been experiencing it, at least from my 20s on forward since the 2000s when it went public, is not what it was probably. Not the form that it had when it was still clandestine, still kind of hidden away, still kind of done in back rooms, and when it was still within a Catholic church being venerated openly in a place in a church in Zacatecas in La Noria. Um, I started realizing, and recently more so, after some of the conversations I had in Mexico City with Doña Queta, after getting access to some people that are actually grew up around the faith in Zacatecas, that Santa Muerte as it is today is actually it's developed from and is turning into two completely different faith lines or practices, I guess. Um, And if you've been following me and see my Instagram account, you're currently seeing a lot of Luciferian um, demonic effigies being venerated in very much the same way as you would a Catholic version of Christ. You see the Christ child effigy now being transformed into a demonic Christ child effigy, and you see a lot of the classic Luciferian characters being portrayed as different types of saints that you can pray to, almost in a weird kind of reverse mockery of the church, which is very much intentional. And at their center, they have a man that goes by the moniker of the Black Bishop. And when you see the practice he's doing and some of the ritual practices that you see at this church that he has in central Mexico, you see cleansing rituals done with razor blades where he cuts angelic script on people's backs. It's a blood ritual. And a lot of the ways that they do their veneration and a lot of the ways they do their offerings, which is alcohol, meat based, sacrifice based, all of that is very reminiscent of Palo or the Afro Caribbean persuasion type of religions. And it's been very interesting for me having some of the old guardians or some of the older Santa Muerte practitioners that I know who are basically Catholic and have the Santa Muerte faith on the side. Now in battle with these the other side of it, who are Santa Muerte initiates or practitioners who just discovered her that don't have the Catholic element to them because they went into the faith without that, or they found the faith in a place where that didn't exist. So now you have these two sides, and it's been very fascinating for me, like trying to figure out, well, number one, where's the commonality or where's the root of this, which is, I think, a lot of people would want to know if this is faith that you found for yourself recently, or if it's something that you've inherited. Um, what is the root of this? Like, is it a Mesoamerican deity that was just repackaged? Um, is it more of a Spanish or a European centric faith practice that was modified by the locals? Or or is it none of the above? And it's a own unique uh, mixture of symbology, occult practices, and elements from the church hodgepodge together by a very desperate and fearful people going through the revolution in Mexico, and before that going into through the War of Independence, and who were just looking desperately for things that they could have faith in. Um, 200, 200 years back is the mention of, and this is from Mexican church records. 2000 years, almost 200 years back, you hear mentions of people in Hidalgo, the state of Hidalgo, openly venerating a skeleton, and they're already calling her the Holy Death, La Santa Muerte, right? And in some of those accounts, you hear them talking about that the fact that they're praying for a Santa Muerte, not to a Santa Muerte. So they're praying for a holy death or a good death was what I managed kind of to piece out from that. And the church that writes about this and some of the people that talk from the church about it speak to it as that they're just locals that are confused and they're using some of the older uh, religions that they had and the skeletons and the skulls that the Mexica had in previous cultures and before the conquest had. But it's I don't I think it's much deeper than that. I think it's probably people just desperate uh looking for a way around things, a backdoor, a spiritual, somebody that Mexico, we have this term called la palanca, basically somebody that can, do you a favor. And this is a common thing you hear a lot with Santa Muerte practitioners and devotees, including Doña Queta in Mexico City. She has said multiple times in interviews that La Santa doesn't do miracles. That is something that only God does. Pero te hace unos parotes, but she will do you favors, right? So this whole aspect of death being this intermediary or um, entity that will do you a favor and who's kind of outside of the bounds of the earthly realm laws, but also very much part of them. Basically, this I don't know, this mercurial, both sides of the fence type energy about it, I guess, or symbolism. It pops up a lot in its early forms. Um, but once you start getting more into its modern space, past the year 2000, it's murky. It starts getting really murky when all the faith practices, the brujos, the practitioners start using her very much as a center or focus for their practices, and the witchcraft and all those aspects just start muddying the waters as far as what that faith practice really was in the past and what it is still to a lot of people that have had that faith practice before it went public, which again, it's kind of brings me back to the interesting place we are now in the faith where this is the first indications of a schism or this weird internal separation, which is interesting. I mean, we're living through the first parts of a public veneration. This is just 2 decades old, which is interesting to kind of experience.
So I cannot wait to get into talking about that split and the differences and the tensions. But just to make sure that I'm getting it too, Ed, because this is so fantastic. You are connecting so many dots. So you found the first reference to the Holy Death was about 200 years ago in the Hidalgo region. And like you said, if I'm understanding it right, today we kind of, as you say, we might analyze things like, is this a Catholic influence? Is this a Mesoamerican, religious influence? But what you're saying is in the Hidalgo region, and this is something that I think is so true. Even if you look at the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri from 2,000 years ago, it is ruthlessly practical. It's people looking for a solution in a desperate situation. So, would it be fair to say that this first reference in the Hidalgo region was people, instead of analyzing a Catholic, or a Mesoamerican, this was people saying, we are in a desperate situation, whatever it is, and we can turn to the Holy Death as a way to not do a miracle, as Doña Quetzal says, but to do a favor. Would that be
Yeah.
somewhat fair?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's what you see in the first parts of it. And there has been people, and myself included, trying to figure out what the connection is to some Mesoamerican practices. Um, I think aspects of duality, people just understanding that death can be black and white, which is interesting because that shows the color of black and white and its dual nature shows up a lot, specifically in its earlier forms. Not so much anymore. You'll see it now in certain effigies of La Santa, which is basically a beautiful woman on one end and a skeleton on the other, or the fact that she's death, but she's also pregnant. It's like a weird duality you see there. If anything, I think the last vestiges or elements of pre-colonial faith practices are in that duality aspect, which I know for a fact is not Catholic, because the Catholic faith, and this from multiple discussions with priests and all that, God wins, you know, every time, good always triumphs. So duality is a satanic concept to them. So yin yang is not allowed. So I know for a fact that that specific part of this faith is probably older. The elements of that are older, and you see them in the ways that Coatlicue or the Tonantzin, the basically where they took a lot of the original faith practice and sites and veneration aspects of La Virgen de Guadalupe, which basically she was depicted in a terrible form, which skirt of snakes, a skull on the middle of a necklace made of hearts and hands, I think. And then you see her beautiful side. It's this corn goddess, and in both of her depictions, she's kind of like there's a lot of serpentine or snake symbology because the Mexica were a snake culture. That's why the Mexican flag has a an eagle eating a snake. The eagle is the Spanish Empire. The snake is the Aztec Empire. That's the symbology there. Um, the I think the earliest forms of it were probably just people influenced by that culture, that the concept of duality, the concept that a goddess can be both terrible and looking and a skeleton, but also a beautiful woman, this aspect of it. Early on, you see basically elements of a skeleton in a dress. Um, you also see a lot of effigies or figures of the good death, which is la buena muerte, which is basically another variation of the Virgin iconography coming from Spain. Black dressed, kind of depicting crying, reminiscent of the Lady of Sorrows. But this one specifically is you pray to her for a good death, right? And I think at some point in the past, praying for a good death became praying to the good death, or praying to the holy, praying for a holy death became praying to the holy death. Um, Somewhere in the past that materialized or formalized. And as far as the surviving effigy of this, which is like that's for me like I that's why I've been obsessed with imagery, iconography, statues, paintings, depictions of it. When I go to some of the older altars, like I take a lot of pictures and a lot of videos, and I share all of them. That's most of what you see on my Instagram is basically me trying to figure things out. Um, I'm always on the lookout for re things that repeat and that repeat in older fashion. There's a friend of mine who is kind of on the same quest. Espiral Morado, the purple spiral on Instagram. Espiral Morado. He also runs a Santissima page as well on Instagram and TikTok. Um, he found a picture of La Santa in a novella, in a telenovela from the 90s, right? It's a statue and a painting of her in purple robes. And then we thought this is the oldest video of La Santa that we could find, and it's from the early 90s. And then we found something from the 70s where somebody, La India Maria, which is like a comic character in Mexico, singing this tenebrous song about just being watching out because death is coming, and she's grabbing a painting, black background, white lining, and it's a painting of death with a halo around her head, right? And that's old, that's 70s era, and I thought this is it, there's nothing older than this probably. And then I started going into that rabbit hole of La Noria. Um, we have a church in Zacatecas it's still running. It only opens up for official events and festivals. Um, but it is a Catholic church and it has been there for centuries. Um, it's right next to a silver mine. Again, the aspect of silver is interesting that it kind of pops up there as far as an element. Um, it There's a lot of documentation that I found around it, and again, I'm gonna show you this book, and I'm gonna share it with your readers. It's in Spanish only. I don't know if there's an English version of this. It's called Suma Esotérica de la Santa Muerte desde la Guardia de la Noria de San Pantaleón. So this was written by the last remaining female guardian of La Santa Muerte's original effigy that was actually venerated within the church, within the Catholic Church, that we know of at least for 200 years. And it's an interesting read. It's not written as a historical document. It's literally a lady that got this lineage inherited to her, just trying to sort it out on a page. So it's and it's the Andrés Serrano Sarriano is the guy that basically published this book. And again, it's mostly a written account of some of the faith practices, and it's not that substantial, but what is in here is mind blowing as far as kind of revealing some of the aspects of the history of it. Number one, it was fully endorsed by the church. At some point in its history, and it's not too clear when this happened, an effigy of this pale skeletal santo, which is about was about that big, was left at the church doors. And people say a lot of there's a lot of legends behind where that statue came from. One that it was brought there by a rich miner that basically brought it from somewhere else, and he venerated there. And when he moved out, he didn't take it with him, and the people that went to his house to clean it out were like, "What the fuck is this?" So let's take it to the church, which is what you do with things that you don't know. Back then, you would take it to the church, and they'll tell you what to do with it, I guess. So apparently, the miners would put it either at the entrance of the mine, or before they would go into the mine, they would just, um, pray for a holy death or a good death. So that's kind of where it started. The whole vision of this effigy of death coming from a hole or a grotto, or the under or the earth, the aspect of it being something that comes from the earth, is pretty interesting, the symbology of that. But when it was found, instead of being burned, thrown away, or destroyed, it was taken in. It was taken in by the church. And it's a pretty small chapel, church there that they had. Not that big, very, very, very simple in its kind of like design. When you go straight into the church, you'll see the veneration altar. You'll see a saint of the you'll see the saints and everything like that laying out in the front. And on your left side is a small chapel door that would lead you into a side room where they would have the image of La Santa Muerte on the wall, uh, in front of a crystal casket of Jesus after his crucifixion. So it's basically it's like a depiction of Jesus when he was not yet resurrected. He's still in his, you know, in his he's still in his death form, I guess, is what you would kind of describe it as. But it's interesting that that's there. And next to the door into this part of the chapel, there's a big depiction of San Miguel Arcangel. Saint Michael is there, which it's interesting that it's still there if you go there. The painting is still there. The casket is removed, and obviously the effigy was taken out of that church. But when you hear the stories about its the veneration, it all happened within the church, under the church's watchful eye. Um, they they came up with or made a official position of who was going to attend to the saint. It's common in a lot of churches. You have people external to the church or community, as far as the community that takes care of or helps dress the saints. Um, but they had this concept of a guardian or an altar guardian, which is interesting because that's the first time I kind of hear some of that wording. The fact that she's a guardian, and also the fact that it had to be a woman, was interesting, specifically around the church. Why that? why that effigy was allowed to stay at the church or remain at the church without having any issues, I'm not too certain. I think it was semantics, wording, or they were trying to, well, this is an effigy of the good death, this is death, and she was defeated by Jesus, so this is the casket of Jesus, and he's here, and this is death, so she's about to give up and let him go, I guess. Or there was some sort of there was some sort of negotiation that happened at some point where, as far as like this shouldn't be here, or this doesn't belong here, and it stayed. And I think it's probably related more so that the townspeople were really basically being turned on to this faith because the church is the church is dedicated to San Pantaleone, right? And he is the least visited saint there. Like they would put more flowers on La Santa, which became an issue later on, probably related to why she was later on kicked out of the church. But you have this effigy of La Santa in church, and a devotional practice started developing there. Now, when you read some of the in this book, and some of the people that I've talked to around that were around for some of the public veneration at that church back in the 70s, you see within that town, right now it's basically a ghost town. The mining died, and I think there's about 20 people living in that area now, and the church is mostly closed, but like tour guides will let you walk in there and look around, and will give you tours of the area. Um, at some point, this thriving mining town basically just went under, and a lot of people started going away. But in the past, it was bustling. I mean, you can still find Zacatecas marked silver from that mine in circulation of collectors and stuff like that. It produced a lot of silver. Some professional base. They had a professional baseball field out there. Some pretty big teams went out to play out there. It was a weird place. Not what you would expect as far as an origin point, I guess, is what I'm saying. This industrial mining town, high up in the hills of Zacatecas. Uh, they have mentions of anima sola practices and rituals, basically people praying to the souls in purgatory, which were in a lot of ways kind of persecuted by the church back then. And there's like a story of a lady that they caught who was who was basically giving out these instructions to women, like if you want your husband not to leave you, you need to do this certain ritual at night in the corral de los animales, where you keep the animals. And she was found out. She was actually tarred and feathered by the church there, and that basically drove a lot of those practices underground. And I suspect that some of those same practices started becoming a bit more hidden, I guess, is what you would say. So we start, in the document that is here, basically that this lady wrote, you see she talks about the if you want to invoke La Santa, you have to burn incense first. And for any invocation, according to the church, that's what she says. According to the church, for any invocation, you have to have your tools ready and cleansed. And you do that during the full moon. And those are all aspects of like something that's outside of the church. This whole aspect of the moon and stuff like that seems like it's outside of it. But when you look at the tools that she talks about, it's it's incense, it's holy water, it's Saint Michael. It is it's stuff that is very much Catholic. It's Catholic ritual, basically, what she's talking about. Um, you start seeing elements of um, how you should pray to her that are basically kind of coming out of this folk practice there. And a lot of this stuff is basically based on this past guy prayed for this and didn't work, and this guy prayed for it, did work. How did you pray different than that guy? So a lot of basically comparisons apparently started happening as far as how she could better hear you. So this took place for 200 years that we know of, at least in a Catholic church. Um, there was an event, a very kind of clear event that ended this relationship. Uh, at some point, people that were venerating her there took that faith practice with the dying mining industry with them and moved across the country. Some of them moved to Mexico City. Some of them moved to places like Juarez, which is interesting because it's the stronghold of the Santa Muerte faith right now. Um, but a lot of people that moved to Mexico City specifically brought their faith with them in the form of small devotional prayer cards with La Santa's, with the Holy Death's image painted on it, which I haven't been able to track down, but I'm still trying to figure out because I need to see that image. Um, but some people say it was just basically a picture of the effigy, the original effigy in Zacatecas, which makes sense. Um, and some people say it's like it was like somebody going to an artist and saying, "Hey, I want you to paint this image of this holy death." And since they didn't have access to the effigy and there were no cell phones to show in the picture, they just came up with this interpretation of what they would imagine a holy death would look like, I guess. So that's when you get some of the uh, freedoms of imagery that they started adding on to La Santa. You know, the hourglass and the globe and the scales. All of these things seem to get added on as this faith practice is kind of like dying out and people are leaving Zacatecas and they're trying to recreate their devotional practices elsewhere by themselves now outside of the frame of the church. So that's, I think, at some point when they leave Zacatecas, that's when it starts getting into a clandestine form because they show up to another church and they're like, "You don't have a Santa Muerte here." It's like, "No, we don't." That's what are you talking about? Um, so that's I think that's where it starts getting uh that's where it starts at that's where a lot of the elements start getting piled on to its original iconography. But when you see its original form, it's a wooden santo. Uh, it's not a skeleton. It's not a skull, but its hands are skeletonized. It's just basically a very thin female face. And the reason why it was always dressed in white, it's because that's the only allowed colors that they were allowed the saint to be dressed in because it was a neutral color. All the other colors had other saints attached to it, so they would just dress her in white. And they would call her La Niña Blanca, which is the oldest nickname or endearing term that I've heard related to La Santa Muerte as a faith practice. La Niña Blanca, the white girl. Um, and it's because that's the term of endearment that some of the guardians would say when they would pull her out of her pedestal when they would do her festivities. They would pull her down and they baja la niña, like pull down the girl, is what they would say. That was a term of endearment. And it went on to be, La Niña Blanca. Now everybody, says thank you, Niña Blanca, and they say the word, but they don't know where it comes from or they don't know the connotations of it. It's like an endearing term for a small effigy of La Santa. That's where La Niña Blanca is a small Santa that you're pulling down from its pedestal because you're gonna clean it, have a festival around it, or do something, ceremonial with it. At some point in the 2000s, when the faith practice was already public, uh, there was a clear and motivated war against the faith by the Catholic Church. They saw it grow in Mexico City at an alarming rate with the introduction of this altar in Mexico City. Um, that's the other side of the faith that I think that's where some of the branching happens as well. You start seeing this. new, people call it a new faith practice. She like if you talk to Ñaqueta, which I have, and you see some of her interviews, and she's adamant about the fact that it's always been there. Like the death, the veneration of death has always been in Mexico. Uh, I asked her about like so as far as you're concerned, where were the where did you get your faith practice? And she talks about her aunt carrying a small picture of a death effigy or a santa, right? And she was the one that showed her how to pray to La Santa Muerte. And when I was reading some of her prayers or original prayers, because if you go to the altar of in Tepito and you're really fucking nice to her, she'll show you she keeps her prayers like in a like in this shitty ass old notebook, but all of her prayers are in there. And what caught my eye is the invocation prayer is almost word for word the same as the invocation prayers in La Noria in San Pantaleon, Zacatecas. So I think there's the connection there as far as where she got some of the original concepts and some of the aspects of faith and how to basically she will ask God for permission to invoke the spirit of death, and that comes directly from La Noria. Um, there's a few other contenders. She mentioned something about a stone skeleton found in the 70s, apparently, that is currently being hidden in a vault somewhere because they're afraid of it being destroyed. I think they're more afraid of people finding out that it's not an ancient Aztec skeleton. It's probably very much modern. But there's a few other contenders for skeletons out there. There's in the South we have uh, San Pascualito Rey, which is like a skeleton version of San Pascual, which is like the story behind it. It's all bizarre, but doesn't match up because it's not a female deity. But again, I think it all traces back and tracks back to this original San Pantaleon church in La Noria in Zacatecas. Now, what happens to it when it gets to Mexico City? Um, according to her, according to Doña Guetta, and again, I'm never going to put words in her mouth because I respect her a lot, and she is definitely she will never call herself anything as far as an authority or stuff like that, but she will shut mouth as far as what she deems not to be true or false. Um, at some point when that faith practice made its way to Mexico, um, she learned it from her aunt. Uh, but this is the Barrio Bravo of Tepito, and there's a lot of things happening in this specific barrio, and there's a lot of things moving around, and a lot of influences coming into this very busy city. Um, and you have figures like Adolfo de Jesus Constanza coming out of this environment. Adolfo was the famous narco satánico individual. Back in the late 80s, he basically did a lot of witchcraft and spiritual work around cartels. And he was Apollo initiate. So he would ask for like, hey, if you want this spell to be cast, I need these body parts from somebody, and they would go out and get these body parts for his ngangas. Um, uh, this is kind of the first introduction to that whole aspect of occult practices, Afro-Caribbean occult practice in Mexico. People hadn't really seen that. Um, so you saw him basically murder an American and use his brain for his to activate his nganga, these cauldrons that they prepare with different type of wood and all of these loads in them. This guy was active around Tepito in Mexico City and some parts of northern Mexico, but this guy was active in a lot of places like that, and he wasn't the only one kind of active in that way. Um, the first, the kind of the first aspects of this uh, forbidden criminal faith practices start showing up through him, I guess, in a lot of ways. And and you have women like Doña Queta at that time who were young, growing up around these Santeria, Palo, Yoruba, all of these faith practices coming into Mexico. Mexico has a straight line of communication to Cuba. Um, El Che Guevara and Fidel Castro basically lived in Mexico City. That's where they prepared their war. And with them there was there still is a very prevalent Cuban community. And a lot of those faith practices made their way to Mexico around that time. Probably were living in Mexico for long periods before that, but a lot of the first aspects of it kind of making its way into public life, specifically into political life, into members of high-ranking police and government officials, kind of like joining into these occult faith practices. That's where it starts in Mexico City around this kind of time. Doña Queta was practicing. She talks about her that she's a believer and a practitioner of Santeria and Palo, right? She's mentioned this, and also when you see her altar in Mexico City, there's a lot of dolls around it. You know, there's a lot of elements that are very reminiscent of Santeria and Palo. And when you see the crafts that she herself makes and sells at the altar, people will be hard pressed to see the differences between some of the necklaces that she's making and giving out to people and some of the prepared necklaces from Santeria or some of the prepared necklaces in Palo, where they incorporate different colors, beads, and even animal parts in some cases. That you're like, wait, but this is Santa Muerte. Like, what does this have to do with that? And you start realizing that she inadvertently or maybe purposely basically took the influence that she had from that side of her spiritual life into the public veneration and public culture of Santa Muerte in Mexico City. Now you see this public altar with a skeleton there, and you see her basically doing a lot of Catholic ritual around it. But now since it's public and it's divorced from the church, you know, they demonized her and they basically went on a holy war against her, which is still going on. The Catholic Church does not like Santa Muerte. They realize how fast it was growing. By probably 2003, 2004 era, the church really realized how fast it was growing and how it was showing up in a lot of different places. Mexico City had a pretty bad earthquake back in the 80s, and a lot of people moved north, and a lot of people moved to Tijuana from Mexico City. A lot of the ladies that I got to kind of learn some of these faith practices from were from that exodus of people from Mexico City up into the border regions. And they brought a snapshot of the faith as it was, you know, pre 2000s, like from the 80s. And what they brought with them is very reminiscent of the stuff that you would see in La Noria, this Catholic church ladies hiding the fact that they're actually praying to this death saint that is forbidden by the church. But with Doña Queta, it was very, very much a not only an open rebellion against the church because people were doing things there and venerating and also, you know, giving money and making donations to this. And that's not the church did not like that. So there was a very clear and public effort to basically go after that faith, demonizing it, calling it a cartel religion or kind of painting it as a cartel religion and coming up with a bunch of stuff around it, like you know, Santa Muerte practitioners will like venerate the devil, or they practice cannibalism, or they human sacrifice. A lot of the weird, um, evil or dark elements of Santa Muerte that some of us hear every now and then are remnants of that propaganda campaign that the church did on the faith for years. Uh, a direct reaction to this war in all the way back at that church in Lenoria. Bishop came and visited the church and was new. This bishop was actually the bishop in Ensenada, my home state. He got moved there. He went to that church and looked to his side and looked into this little prayer room, and he was like, "What's this doing here?" You know. Uh, and that's when the divorce happened. Um, they had an accident where it burned. Some people say it was an accident. Some people say it was purposely burned. They reconstructed it and and placed it back into that church. And it lasted a few years in there. And then the visit from this bishop happened and completely was like, this can't be here anymore. And basically told the guardian of this effigy, take it with you or else I'll destroy it. And that's, she grabbed it and ran with it. Basically, that's the story that of how the divorce happened. Um, and they made a shrine to it right across the way. It's like a 5 minute walk from the church. The a small little shrine was made to her effigy, and lo and behold, if you go there now during festival season, the church is way emptier than the Santa Muerte altar. You know, the saying that they have is the lights left the lights left the Church of Pantaleone, and then they now reside at the chapel. This whole aspect of this divorce and the holy war of a sorts that went on against this faith practice, and it's still going around this faith practice, has morphed now because we have this Luciferian practice now, kind of like growing up around it as well, which we could talk about as well. But deep down, kind of like all the way in the past, this is very much either a Mesoamerican inspired duality um, practice of some sort, and with a close relationship to death, which is very much in jive with Mexican and pre-Columbian culture, um, where they were praying to a good death, or for a good death, or for a holy death that got transformed into praying to a holy death, an intermediary or somebody that could do you favors. Um, that's probably what it was at its start. And a lot of the things that have been added on to it, specifically recently as it went public, those are all external things that are getting added on to it. And a lot of these things are coming from commercial practices. Um, how can you sell more than one statue to somebody? Well, make it a faith practice where you have to have multiple ones, you know? Um, and how can you educate your public like that? Well, start making public altars where the shops are, where you can sell and also show your wares. So you have multiple statues in your public altar, which is actually a sales room, but people are looking at that as like, oh, that's how it's done. So in their homes, they have all these, they have a setup with all these statues, but they're basically replicating a storefront and not an actual altar, which is again, you start getting these weird uh, expressions of faith that come from confused people or from people that are not really kind of knowing what they're doing. So a lot of these things are just kind of growing from an unstructured, there's no recognized authority in Santa Muerte except for two people, uh, which is interesting to kind of talk about this. Um, within this book, the lady that writes it, the guardian of this book, it basically that describes the figure of a guardian and what makes a guardian. And she talks about the fact that a public altar or a place of veneration that is dedicated to her is a place where you it's a place that is loaded by the spiritual energy of a community. And that community needs to be defended. So when she took that statue and ran from the church and protected it, that was her act that confirmed her as a guardian, right? And when Doña Queta started that public altar and basically went toe to toe with the church and with a lot of people about that faith practice, that qualifies her as a guardian as well, right? And a big part of being a guardian is also you don't have any titles. So there's no, I'm the high priestess of Santa Muerte, or I'm the Sorceress, Supremo, Santa Muerte. None of these titles exist. None of these things are real. The only official recognized title, when I say official, I mean the only title that I've recognized within text and history is the figure of this guardian figure. It's always a woman. It's always a female that has had kids. And it's a woman that basically devotes herself to be a guardian to an altar and defends it. This whole aspect of altars being attacked, destroyed, burned, rebuilt is very kind of like, oh, I think it probably comes from the trauma of having that effigy burned once and then kicked out of the church. I think this whole aspect of protection and rebuilding and kind of rebelling against it, I think that's where a lot of the clandestine nature of the faith kind of like also came up, originated. But now you're basically starting to you're starting to see a clearer picture of what this faith practice is and what it's not. Oh, there's a lot of magical folk magic and a lot of practices of incantation and them using La Santa as a spirit for vengeance, uh, for other things that she's probably not originally meant for. Um, but in a lot of ways, if you look at how the practice was originally, you ask God for permission to invoke her, which is basically she was treated just like every single other Catholic saint, right? You first have to ask God for permission, and then you invoke whatever saint you're going to invoke, and you come up with a very specific prayer for that saint. And mandas are a thing where if you do this for me, I will do this for you. Um, and that's at the bare bones structure basis of this. That's what you're seeing. A Catholic devotional practice towards a saint, forbidden one now, but not for almost 200 years under their own nose. But that's realistically what I've been able to kind of piece out of what it really is.
This is incredible, and I have so many notes here. Let me see if I can get through some of this. So, let me ask you this: approximately what year in the small, now abandoned silver mining town in the Zacatecas region, what year did that church close approximately, and what year did that migration begin to Mexico City and
So
other areas?
the mine started dying in the 70s,
The
in the
70s.
70s and 80s. And people started leaving, not immediately, but in droves. But there's still people living there. But the basically a lot of that mining failing basically took seeds of the faith practice across the country. Um, Interestingly enough, a lot of those people actually landed in places like Catemaco, which is the historical center of witchcraft in Mexico, and that's where some people say that there's the third guardian. I don't consider it's a man, so I don't consider it. I don't think it counts. But that's just me. Um, but a lot of the faith practices basically moved across the country, and started adapting either local practices to its its the form they would venerate, or um, it took some of the same elements where it was from, and it was just prayed to or done in back rooms and privately. For example, uh, the faith practice came to a place like Tijuana, my hometown. If you go to Tijuana and you go around and look at some of the public altars, you'll see a lot of spent candles left in the open. So you'll see these cluttered spent candles left out. There's a reason behind that, which is pretty funny. I'll tell you in a bit. But you'll see a lot of found objects or objects of devotion or things that people bring in that what can I give you? And they'll just take something off and leave it there as an offering. A lot of these altars are low to the ground. They're not high up. They're low to the ground. And I couldn't figure out where that came from until somebody pointed out that the fact that you have to be on your belly or on your knees when you approach it. So it's not low to the ground. You're just too high for it. You're just standing, right? You just fucking put yourself on the ground. So a big part of the Tijuana style of it was the fact that these altars were low to the ground, cluttered. Saint Michael was always there. because they brought that with them. Which is funny because in Mexico City that's not the case always. So they lost that at some point. But you see it in places like Baja. There's always a Saint Michael there. There's water goblets that are very reminiscent of some of the spiritismo practices and stuff like that in Santeria and some of the Yoruba practices as well. So there's an intermix of that. There's multiple rosaries, crucifixes, and necklaces added on to the effigies as a gift. Again, reminiscent of some of those Afro-Caribbean practices. Uh, and finally, one of the interesting bits that I haven't seen that much elsewhere, the inclusion of human bones in the practice. They there's altars in Tijuana that have human bones at their core. They make these. There's no other way of describing it. It's an nganga. They make a pot and or a basket, and they put either animal bones and human bones inside of it to activate this altar or ritual space. Um, and sometimes it's a human skull, that's in there. And you will never see it because it's at the base or underneath the base, and it's kind of meant to be hidden because they probably don't want to freak people out, and also it's like a probably not meant to be seen, I guess. Um, but you go to other places like Mexico City, and the altars are in public. San Miguel is not there anymore, but there's devils, a lot of it's Luciferian stuff there. There's Malverde, who's like the other forbidden Satan in Mexico, usually standing next to La Santa. Um, it just has a different flavor, and that's what you're starting to see, just different flavors of it as it pops up in different places. Like, oh, we're gonna venerate death. Let's add our let's add our practices to this, or let's put our practices around it. I recently shared like 2 or 3 videos of a Palo practitioner in Mexico who has, an open altar to La Santa Muerte, and it's a Palo practice, and you could see at the bottom of the effigy are human skulls. So you like you start to wonder, like, is are what we're seeing in different places where it's landing, are we seeing basically Palo and Santero people adopting it as in their faith practices and shrouding it in their practices as well? Are you seeing people trying to sell statues and just adding things to it that they want to sell as well? They have a lot of Santero stuff. We could probably sell it or pair it with this. Are you seeing this sales campaign, basically, is what I'm saying? Or are you seeing something authentic that has a reasoning or some sort of science behind it or a history? And is it even important for people? Some people just don't care. Some people will say La Santa Muerte is my deity, and they ask it for everything, like if it was a effigy of Santa Claus, right? Which is completely not how it works, but that's how people believe in her in a lot of ways. So for me it's been a process of trying to figure out in an honest way where this comes from, what the basis of it is, what the thorough line of it is, and and just like educate people on what it is and what elements of it probably shouldn't be taken from it or divorced from it. Which kind of leads me to where it is now. Um, it is Santa Muerte as a faith practice is now being, like, I've gotten pictures of altars in Russia. Um, I found one. I've talked about this before. I was in Connecticut out of all places, and somebody said there was an altar there, and I went to visit it. It's like, it's everywhere. It's making its way to South America, which is weird for Mexico to export a spiritual practice, but it's making its way into South America. It's making its way into faith practices like Santeria, like Palo, where you're seeing it now being kind of melded together with some of their faith practices in this weird reverse Uno of influences. Um, and you're seeing it all over the US. You're seeing a lot of TikTokers and influencers online speaking of it as authority figures that are, I don't know, like I listen to them as somebody who grew up with the faith, and I don't understand what they're kind of talking about as far as how they're utilizing it for, uh, you know, influencing events and moving things around in reality, the aspect of what they're adding on to it. Um, but deep down in the past, like what was it, and why does it resonate, and why is it growing, and what it's about, and specifically now, it's very important now because I think we're in a very interesting place in the faith. And if you look at some of the online rhetoric, which I do because everybody sends me everything, um, there's a few people online who are basically were Catholic priests or priests that wanted to be a Catholic priest and now are basically just doing, their own thing, wearing the religious garbs and doing all the Catholic ritual around La Santa. They're doing this online, so they have these misas online on TikTok, like these hours long misas, and they're dressed in the Catholic garb. They're doing the Catholic ritual. There's a effigy of death behind them, but there's the crucifix is always higher, you know, because they have that tradition. And on the other end, you're seeing, the brujos or the more of the witchcraft, witch influenced Santeria Palo people, now putting the image of the devil next to La Santa, right? And basically saying they pray to both. There's like actually a popular Mexican song right now that it's like a cartel member screaming that yo le rezo al diablo y también a la muerte. Like I pray to the devil and also to death. Like what do I have to worry about? I pray to both. So there's this weird explosion of this Luciferian imagery and iconography in the form of this Angelito Negro, as they call it. It's not just him. Like there's a gold Mamon effigy that is very much about riches and having money, also being venerated. The Baphomet iconography, for some absurd reason, has made a giant resurgence in Mexico City, and they have a lot of Baphomet iconography being melted with Santa Muerte and all of these other things. So it's interesting to see how it is now, and it's basically a confirmation of a lot of things that the church was saying in a propagandist way back in the early 2000s about what Santa Muerte is: a satanic practice for criminals, or an evil practice, Luciferian practice, or that the devil was basically hidden behind the imagery of this angel of death because death didn't exist, because Christ destroyed death, is what they would say. And now you're seeing this Luciferian practice being kind of melded, basically confirming this. Um, either it means that the church is either it means that the church is too weak to even influence anything like that anymore in Mexico, which is probably true, or the fact that people are actively divorcing themselves from the church in general. Um, I was baptized. I went through communion. I did all my thing, like Catholic, you know. Um, I've met many practitioner now, or people that are in the faith that aren't Catholic, that never went to communion, and doesn't matter uh, realistically, but they're bringing other things in with them sometimes. When I say that, I mean they're mixing and melding things that if you had any sort of concept of what an elder was, or a mentor, or somebody that went through things before, and you would ask him like, "Hey, I'm trying to emulate you, or I'm trying to emulate your faith practice, or give me some information," and they see you bringing in this giant Luciferian statue with a fertility symbol coming out of his legs, a pretty substantial fertility symbol coming out of his legs, uh, and you start feeding it blood. While on the other hand, you have an effigy of La Santa Muerte, and you start feeding her flowers. Uh, is there something wrong with that? I don't know. Like that's not my realm. I don't do it myself. Uh, but it's interesting to see where it is now. This split between the conservative Santa Muerte people, because that's what they are, uh, and this new line of Santa Muerte practitioners who are coming into this. without any sort of basis in Catholicism, which is basically the structure around most of the ritual and invocation around La Santa. So they don't have that, or with this misguided kind of notion that somehow La Santa Muerte is uh, a native, pure entity that has no Spanish or no outside European influence in it, which is also false. It's very much a product of mestizaje, or basically the mixture of both cultures. Um, so it leaves us in an interesting place where people are like, at least for me, I'm still trying to figure out where this is going to head next. You see it online. I mean, it's exploding on places like TikTok. It's the amount of attention it's getting, the amount of people that are converting or are self-identifying as devotees, or that people that are devoted to the veneration of La Santa. It's pretty amazing. To me it is. Like, finding people like that on the road that approach me with that specific faith practice and like, hey, I'm also like a devotee, and like, oh, cool. Like, how do you, like, I always ask him, like, how do you venerate? Like, what's that like for you? Like, what does an offering mean to you? Do you know what a manda is? When you invoke her, if you do an invocation, who do you ask for permission? The aspects of that, and it's not that I know better or am better or anything like that. It's just like I got this from a different source than most. So, and I am very much about ancestor worship as well, which I think it's kind of like part and parcel for most Mexicans. And I know a lot of people died keeping this alive, and a lot of people struggled keeping this alive for a long period under the nose of the church. And do we want to do them the dishonor, the service of ex extracting this from it? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and the one of the guardians, as you mentioned, when she wrote effectively in the Zacatecas region, wrote effectively that book you showed, Ed, is a grimoire, right? That is a manual of working with La Santa. And my brain is always in ritual magic and Western magic. And so when I hear things exactly like you need to first ask God for permission, that is so similar to almost every operation with the grimoires, consecratio Dei, right? Asking for the divine, and then moving forth with Saint Michael. And the Michael statue reminds me of the concept of thwarting angels that are used in order to, as effectively binding angels over other beings. And then you mentioned holy water. You mentioned she was writing as well in the Zacatecas region about the operation of the full moon, paying attention to the lunar cycle. So it seems like before that split. So we're talking obviously 200 years ago in the Hidalgo region, but then the decades since then, there are these churches like in the Zacatecas region kind of allow it a little bit or kind of have this. You have the locals very much, and then all of a sudden you have these themes of, would it be fair to say that before the split you had these Catholic themes like holy water and using the ritual that Doña Ketek was doing with kind of the Catholic ritual, but then you also have these things outside of Catholicism
Y-
coming in too.
Yeah, the stories and mentions of these ladies basically practicing these venerations of la anima sola, or these souls in purgatory, and asking them for favors and stuff like that. That was around that time, and it's mentioned, and it's there. The fact that they tarred and feathered one of them was probably a good sign for people to keep quiet about it. But when you read the manual, this grimoire, as you say, um, you'll see mentions of herbs that are preferred by her as far as what she likes. It's not white sage, by the way, which is like what a lot of us use, and I had to change mine up. Um, I actually published what those are, and I will again on my Instagram account if people want to like pay some attention to that. I'll post some of my notes. But it's mostly like I mean they're mostly kind of utilizing some native herbs, and the kind of mention of roses and flowers around her. The mention of mandas being being paid. Basically, if you ask her for something, you have to promise something. You don't have to offer something, you promise it. And this whole concept you have now where people are like, if you don't deliver, she'll take one of your family members. That's church propaganda. So stop propagating church propaganda because that's exactly what they invented around her to kind of scare people off. Basically, if you offer something, you have to pay it. Uh, I asked to be free of alcohol. And when I went on my sobriety, I went to a shrine and I asked to be free of alcohol and I offered to rebuild it if I survived it, right? So as soon as I survived it, I went back there and I rebuilt that shrine that gets being destroyed in Tijuana, right? That was my manda. What happens if I don't do it? I don't know. I wouldn't be at peace. So I think maybe that's how she gets to you. I don't know. For me, it's mostly uh, having an open relationship with death in life, and this whole aspect of her in the way that she is described in some of these original folk practices around her is very much of a mother, very much of a loving family member, uh, somebody that's dear. They have this whole aspect of just being devoted to her. Again, if you go to a Catholic church where there's a Virgin Mary or one of the many versions of La Virgen del Pilar, all of these different types of virgins, and you see some of the church women devotion to her to these effigies. They dress them, they comb their hair. Sometimes they get their hair done before they go on a festival. Their hands get kissed, they get hugged. People fight for the honor to carry the effigy as they run out the church. Same things happen around La Santa. It's all the same. Uh, you'll see Santa Muerte effigies being dressed. The original public altar in Mexico City has the same practice. Every year she will dress it differently. And where do you think she got that practice from? It's it's probably related to some of the traditions she learned both from the Catholic influence that she has and also from some of the stuff you can trace back to La Noria. Uh, what you're seeing now, I think it's that it's this this explosion of new influences and people wanting to get into a business because that's a big aspect of this business, you know. Uh, they're coming up with these new statues that are different. I remember a few years back, you started seeing a lot of Santa Marta statues wearing these Aztec headdresses and being more native um, in their way. Although those headdresses have no historical context in Mexico, but that they tried, right? Um, but you see these effigies that are more native now, and you can see like a clear like we're not gonna focus on the Catholic symbology anymore. We're gonna focus on more on the native stuff. So you start seeing a lot of that kind of being fostered more in certain parts of Mexico. Catemaco is one of them. Like Catemaco's Santa Marta practice is infused with everything. It's I've been around it, and it's like I again, it's like hardcore Satanism mixed with Santa Muerte practice, and more so ritual magic, angelic script being written on walls and on grounds. More of that, more of the 1970s occultist, Satanist occultist books that somehow made it the way down there and kind of being kind of infused into the faith practice. I think that's where you see some of the sigils probably popping up and coming from, some of these places that had this that had kind of pre-existing and very extreme kind of faith practices. People want an experience, go to Catemaco. Catemaco is insane. That's like the occultist uh mecca of Mexico. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But some of it is almost going to be kind of unrecognizable to Western eyes, I guess, or funny. Like a lot of these guys will basically dress up as cosplay characters, almost like Gandalf during rituals, it's a weird place. But yeah, what again? One thing I'm just noticing now, after years of this and amassing a substantial collection of some original devotional items and figuring out how to get conversations with people that are generally pretty standoffish. And also just having this faith practice for a long time and not really knowing where it comes from or knowing some of the elements of it, where they originated from or why I'm doing certain things. Uh, it's been for me, it's been enriching. At least it kind of confirms my faith, I guess, in a lot of ways. Um, one, I have no issue. I have no issue with it being kind of outside of the church. It makes sense in a lot of ways, but it was inside of the church for a long period of time. So I think it gives us all as Catholics a pass. I mean, if the Catholic Church says it was okay for like 300 years, then I haven't gotten the memo that it's not okay from the Vatican. So I think I could continue on, right? So there's no issue there. In a lot of ways, that's what you get from some of the older practitioners. They're like, hey, how can you compromise between this that the church says you shouldn't do and this that you're doing? And it's like, but they did let us do it for almost 300 years in the church. So they changed their mind. So they could change it again, I guess. So that's the attitude that some of these guys and women adopt.
Absolutely. Well, and speaking very, very broadly, you've sketched out this split, obviously. So on the one hand, as you say, you have, say, the more conservative, maybe Catholic influenced Santa Muerte devotees. On the other side, again, broadly speaking, you have this kind of new emerging Luciferian aspect, devoid, separated from, not influenced by the Catholic side. And so here's my question. When I hear you share about Doña Queta, for example, in the Tepito Barrio, she seems like somebody who straddled both worlds, and she has kind of that Catholic ritual. But in the 1980s, as you mentioned, if I got it right, she in the 1980s, it sounds like you have two things happening. You have the influence of some of the cartels, like you were mentioning, a few practices there and a few practitioners weaving in things. But you also had in the 1980s that infusion or the emergence of some of those Palo, Santeria practices. So here's my question. So Doña Queta kind of straddles both worlds. She's in the shadow land between the light and the dark, if you will, between the Catholic Santa Muerte and, say, these other traditions. But now that we have this split, here's my question. Do you think that practitioners like Doña Queta who come from both of those worlds will become more rare and it'll become more and more separate? Or do you think that practitioners like Doña Queta will still
I think
continue?
I think Doña Queta's main stance is of neutrality. That's her main
Ah,
stance, right?
okay.
And it's a great one to
Yeah.
have when you're in a position like hers. But she will openly say that she prays to the devil, that that she will openly say that she prays to death, and that she has that all of the celestial court gets asked for permission first, though, because all the other ones are just agents that you can ask favors of, but none of them will provide a miracle. So that's kind of how she kind of manages it. Yes, the Catholic individuals that had a veneration of death kind of in the closet and then publicly, that grew up in the church and then have this as a side faith or an added on element of faith. I think that's probably what's going to die out. That's what's rare now, because again, people don't go to the church anymore. Churches are closing down. The church is shrinking in Mexico, out of all places. The attendance is down, and it's not. I don't see it getting any better. So I'm seeing some of the elements of the faith as they were dying out. Just people that I've met many Santa Muerte practitioners who can't say the rosary, right? Or who can't who don't know how to do the sign of the cross, and it's for me, like, that's how I saw it. So it's not, but that's not how it's going to be now. It's changing. Um, I think there's going to be a struggle and a fight like everything related to this. But I'm seeing elements of the more conservative and old school aspect of La Santa not being too hip to include Lucifer in their faith practice. And when you go to Tepito now, every first of the month they have these events there. You are now seeing, you know, the classic image of these people carrying around the Santa Muerte statue on their knees, paying for Tamanda, and some people partying in the corners with devil effigies, you know, it's, and melding, and that's the public center of the faith right now. So what is it going to turn into, and where is it going? I don't know. The morality aspect of it, or some of the rule sets that some of the Luciferian people have, are exactly what you would expect, right? Uh, and they don't jive with at least some of the aspects of the spirituality and morality that I got from the faith. So again, it's going to be interesting to see where this kind of goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you say too, Ed? I just want to make sure I got this right. That when you looked at that original booklet that you shared, I'm calling it a grimoire, but again, I'm not trying to label it. But this Guardian from the Zacatecas region writing about this, did you say that the language of the invocation was very, very similar to what Doña Queta
Yeah,
was reciting
it's
too?
so I'll let me see if I can find it here and I'll
Yeah,
uh,
that's amazing. I mean, just for the listeners while you're looking that up, because for me, this goes directly to your point about the element of transmission. How do you transmit this from
yeah.
generation to generation? Yeah, please go ahead.
So it's and this is a an invocation prayer for help from la Santa. Señor, ante tu divina presencia, Dios Todopoderoso, Lord, under your divine presence, God Almighty. Padre, Hijo y Espíritu Santo, te pido permiso para invocar a la Santísima Muerte. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I ask you for permission to invoke the Holy Death. Mi niña blanca, quiero pedirte humildemente que rompas y destruyas todo hechizo, encantamiento y oscuridad que se presente. My white child, my white girl, I want to ask you humbly to break and destroy all witchcraft, enchantment, and darkness that gets presented to my person, um, in my house, at my work, on my way. Uh, Santísima Muerte, take away all envy, poverty, and this love and unemployment from me. And I ask you with and I ask you with all my heart for you to grant me this petition. And then there's a series of Padre Nuestros and the Rosary, and it has to be said many times. But at the very top of this, Señor, ante tu divina presencia, Dios Todopoderoso, the same implication basically is exactly word for word some of the stuff that gets said at the public altar when I think that's
Wow.
I think that's where some of this stuff kind of links. The the stance of Doña Queta, I appreciate it and I respect it a lot because this isn't Catholicism, you know. We're not a part that this faith practice is no longer accepted or recognized in the Catholic Church. And I get that she's basically saying, okay, then this is if that's what the church wants, you know, let's just be open to anything. But she herself has said that she's never going to dictate anything. She's never going to leave a way of things to be done. Um, she's in her 70s. She hasn't left any clear person that's going to be in charge of that altar that I can see. She hasn't if, yeah, she hasn't published any books on devotional practices because again, she's very adamant about the fact that she's not an authority figure, she's just a guardian. And that's what you get from these women. again, this written text that I have here was written by somebody who was basically taking dictation from her. But it's interesting in the way it's formed. The fact that they're always humble enough to just, I'm a guardian, but like I'm a servant. I'm behind, but she's in front, just talk to her. I'm just here to accommodate your conversation, basically. Um, that's what a guardian is. It's somebody that guards these public altars, which again, if you look at how they're described, it is basically a place where you charge your statues or you activate your statues. It has to be a public altar. It's a place where you have the access to the collective veneration of a group of people towards La Santa. And if it's an altar that's been attacked, like the one in Tepito, for some reason there's a power to it. It's funny seeing now during the festivities around La Santa in Zacatecas where the original effigy is. They have the original effigies remains in a glass case. They're burned, and the recreation of it is above it. Um, when you go there now during celebrations, you see the influence of devotional practices from Tepito arriving there, right? So all the people that got initiated or kind of introduced to the faith in places like Tepito or elsewhere in the country where it's this current wild trans faith practice forms of all of, like you'll see people arriving at the festival dancing these native dances around La Santa, which I'd never seen before, but apparently there's a whole group of people that kind of infusing native dance into Santa Muerte veneration on the northern Mexican border. It's fascinating to see how they're kind of like developing these dances around her, but they're arriving to Zacatecas, and the people from Zacatecas are like, I've never seen that before. Like, what's going on? They're arriving with banda, with musicians, which again is that wasn't originally there, but cool. They're arriving with alcohol. Some nefarious types are arriving, which again are like, oh, okay. Some people with heavily tattooed are arriving to some of these festivities, and again, it's just different. It's interesting to see how it's a snake eating its tail in a lot of ways. The influence of Zacatecas going to Tepito and then coming back almost unrecognizable back to itself. Um, and now the devotional celebrations of around that church are bigger at the shrine of La Santa than they are of the original church where it lived. So there's some sort of poetic beauty and justice there that I just haven't been able to kind of define, but it's interesting that that's where we ended up.
And in your research, and as you've delved into tracing the history, and especially that was wild, you reciting that exact same language of the invocations as well. Among the more, as you say, the more say conservative devotees, the more Catholic influenced, or I guess among the other group, are you seeing any signs that these of a continuity, that these invocations, like the language is being passed on, that these traditions, like the invocate, is that being passed on,
At,
or
at
is it
least
not?
at least with Doña Queta, I see it is because I've seen other women take her place when she can't participate. I see some of those prayers being basically written down and then republished in books that are then sold in botanicas and witchcraft places across the world. I remember seeing an invocation very much like this in a book by an American, and somebody asking me like about like, wait, why do I have to have permission to God to invoke La Santa? Isn't she like her own energy or spirit? Like, isn't she a jealous? Like, who told you that? I was like, I don't know. Like, I read this in here, and like again, this whole aspect of it kind of being a nebulous new faith practice, which is very much very old, probably, but it's new to most. And how people are basically kind of making up the rules for themselves, or they're trying to fill in the voids that they just don't have because nobody has kind of really done their homework around trying to piece this all together. But when you kind of when you kind of look at the way it is now versus how it was when I first got started in it, um, I see the same elements: uh, sacred space, public altars, um, defiance. A defiance aspect of it. Like, yeah, I know it's not allowed by the church, but fuck it, we're doing it anyway, right? Um, the aspect of it, the aspect of you as a practitioner to prove your faith by being public with it, by carrying death behind the cross at a church event, by having an effigy in public, by going to a public shrine, by showing your devotion publicly, by expressing your faith publicly. You can trace that back to Lenoria, which basically means going to the church and giving her flowers and the devotion, being public and wearing some of her regalia. But once she was kicked out of the church, it's a different. It comes up. There's a different meaning behind it. But basically, the element of you being public with your devotion, having a Santa Muerte hanging from your neck, having a tattoo is an element that probably evolved from that. But just having the effigy present in your life and also just saying, "Hey, are you a Santa Muerte practitioner?" Yeah, I am. Like that in and of itself, being not closeted with it holds like an interesting place as far as a commonality that I've been able to track back down all the way to La Noria. Um, the Catholic invocations aspect of it haven't changed. Um, some of the elements around rosaries that I keep seeing pop up over and over again haven't changed as well. I have a few old ones here. Uh, the silver and black.
Oh yeah, with the skull right there. Wow.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, that's a San Pasqual medallion, which is
Oh.
another one we were trying to suspicious about being the origin point. Um, and of course, the skull of David right there on the bottom of that cross. Um, but when the commonalities that I see is the color aspects of it. Originally, there were only three colors that they would kind of like recognize, and it was black, red, and white. These were the three colors of La Santa. And, I was trying to find some sort of esoteric thing around it. And according to the women that I talked to who were part of that veneration in that town, it's the fact that they only had tr- three dress colors that they could dress her in, according to the church officials. You can dress her in white, you could dress her in white, you could dress her in red, or you can dress her in black. But that's about it. So those are the three colors. And they don't, we can add probably later on there was some esoteric thing added on to it as far as a meaning, but it was just the fact that she had a very small wardrobe. That's that's where those original three colors came from. Um, but her main color was white, and this whole aspect of the fact that the color that she presents herself to you in is the color that you venerate her in. Um, People have this notion that she will appear to you in a color, and that's how you should venerate her in, right? So to some people, she presents as white, red, or black, or whatever. In the past, it was like when you would go visit her for the first time, what color was she? And that's your color, you know? Uh, for me, it was black. She presented as black, and I didn't have a vision about her. I had a job title that required me to do very risky things, and when I was blessed around her, the effigy was black, and I was told that you have her black, right? That's who she should be with you. And when I got out of the job, I went, I sought out a lot of help from different people, spiritual help, to try and get myself into a better place after some of those experiences. And one of those people was Doña Queta, and she told me like, "Do you still have is your statue still black?" It's like, "Yeah." Change it.
Ha. That was Doña Queta sharing that. Yep. Hmm.
Change it. It's like, you can? Yeah. Okay. So it became white. And I think it's red now because I'm working on something. But it's a symbol. It's a symbol. It's there's no I'm not casting out any sort of energy or anything like that. For me, it's like how can I communicate to myself and in my practice and my faith that I am cleansing myself? Well, white, sobriety. Um, how can I communicate myself that I want to invite life into my life, or I want to invite happiness or love into my life? Red, right? So
Hmm.
if people are kind of curious about how every now and then I change my personal, well, I want to call it my personal altar. It's in the altar that I keep for La Santa en el Monje on Instagram. It's a very much like a collective altar. There's a few people that basically kind of visit it and move things around, put flowers out and stuff like that. But it's basically a place where I kind of work on myself. That's how I learned that. These faith practices in the past were all about humility, asking for protection, asking for strength,
Hmm.
and seeking hope within the unknown, right? Um, if you are somebody like I remember having this conversation with one of the ladies that showed me some of these aspects of devotion, where she was like, what are you asking for? Like, what do you ask for?" And it's interesting because it kind of like reflects some of the stuff that I've seen in La Noria as well. I was like, I'm just asking to come home safe, right? I was like, what does that mean? And I don't know. What do you mean come home safe? Like, not come home shot, not come home stabbed, not come home in a body bag, to come home at all. Yeah, it's just like you're asking the wrong person. You're asking the wrong spirit for this. Like, what do you mean? Uh, Everything you're trying to avoid in life is going to happen. Like, what do you mean?
Mm.
Like, are you worried about your friends dying? Yeah, they're all gonna die. Are you worried about your house collapsing? Yeah, it's gonna collapse. Everything you're worried about is gonna happen anyway,
Right.
and you're asking the energy or the spirit that does that, to keep it from happening. That's not how this works. It's like it was a moment for me that I kind of realized that um, when you ask for anything, or at least in my end, when I started figuring some of this stuff out, and also when I started seeing some of it basically reflected in some of the workings from some of the original Guardians, um, w- you you don't ask for anything that you yourself can give yourself. You're not asking for it to be granted. You're asking for the strength and ability to grant it yourself for yourself. That's all it is. You can't ask for anything that you can't yourself grant for yourself. That's kind of like the gist of it. And if it's something for somebody else, what part are you playing into what you're asking for? It's not just like saying, "Hey, I want to be a doctor," and just lay back and have that happen. Um, the aspect of intention and realizing that the energy or spirit you're talking to is uh, death, and also realizing that death there can't be death without life, so it has to be both, right? The duality aspect of it. And again, that's another thing that just keeps popping up over and over again, even far back.
That's so, listeners, I hope you appreciate that as much as I do. That is incredibly profound about not asking her for something that is going to be inevitable. And Ed, I'm thinking of the silver miners in the Zacatecas region. They weren't asking her. Instead, they were asking her for the good death. In other words, would it be fair to say that La Santa almost seems to be this representative of this power of radical acceptance. I mean, this is accepting, not avoiding it, and would that be somewhat fair? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, basically, uh, if death is an unknown, a predator, like a blackness, chaos, you have these people basically going into the mother's womb of a cave or a mine, you know. I was going into the darkness of a drug war. You you ask for, people ask, say, are you asking for protection? Uh, I think more so than anything, you're trying to just have a relationship to death so she ceases to become an enemy or a predator or somebody that's running behind you. And the whole classic image of her walking beside you kind of comes into play. Uh, you want her to be somebody familiar. And this whole ability that humans have to anthropomorphize, you know, very complex things, I think she is kind of an expression of that, where people are trying to make sense of the unknowable, or the vast. Um, I remember having this and one of my teachers basically saying, that when you would see the shroud of stars on La Virgen de Guadalupe, she was always adamant that La Virgen de Guadalupe was just basically the other side of the coin for La Santa. That was her kind of like belief system. Um, and I would ask her like, so so I can see where the influence of the Virgin is on La Santa's side because she's a female. What's the influence on the Virgin side? Where do I see death on her? And she says it's in her on her shroud. Um, the shroud that's covered in stars. Yeah, yeah. Death is behind the stars. She's the blackness behind the stars. Like
Oh,
this,
yeah.
my, this this concept of her being basically this void, this blast, this vastness of it. When you get into some of the more, the mystic side of Santa Muerte, which is out there. The problem with it though is that it's hard to access the mystical side of Santa Muerte, and some of the ritualistic side of Santa Muerte is very hardcore. It's very much penance based, and there's a lot of
Oh, interesting. Penance
there,
based. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of self-punishment and self-torture aspects to some of the ways that veneration is done. And I've only encountered a few mentions of ritual drug use done in the
Mm.
context of Santa Muerte. Uh, but I've seen a lot of it in Santa Muerte practitioners who also have, these side faith practices like Santeria, like some of the people that are practicing Palo, and some of the people that have more like different esoteric practices related, and they just add mushrooms into it or add
Mm.
peyote, add bufo.
Ayahuasca. Well, bufo.
No, not ayahuasca because we're too far north for that, but bufo,
Uh,
that I've kind of like, oh, these guys are using this.
the bufo. Oh, interesting on that. Yeah. Mm.
Bufo is very much a SETI thing. It's from the natives in Sonora. Um, people found that practice and took it into their own practices. So you're seeing brujos around Mexico and some Santa Muerte church faith groups basically utilizing it for some of their own, uses as far as a tool to commune or to speak to or to I don't know, to have these healing events. Um, you're seeing that I've seen bufo, I've seen mushrooms, magic mushrooms, basically, and those are old in Mexico. I think Santa Sabina was giving them to the Beatles back in the '60s, so it's been a while that the thing's been around. Um, and the more obscure one and the one that I wasn't exposed to, the tura. Datura, which is a white flower that grows on a vine
Oh.
that has been described as one of the worst drugs or most horrific drugs to take on the planet. if
Wow.
you're ingesting a large amount of it. And again, speaking back on some of my own personal experiences, some of the rituals that were performed around my introduction into this faith practice is a practice when I was just older, was this ritual burial where
Mhm.
we were given this liquid, and for a long time I thought it was peyote or something like that. Uh, and it was only a few years back that I started doing the math and talking to a few people that know their stuff more than I do, and just confirming that it was probably the tura flower, or some sort of extract from the tura that was utilized on us to provoke vision, you know.
Wow. So,
But
okay. So Ed, this brings up something that you've touched on in every one of the podcasts that we've done, which has inspired a lot of people, and that is you've had experiences very few people can really understand what it's even like to go through or even imagine that. And one of your big themes is redemption, and one of your big themes is showing people that you can navigate the darkness and share lessons. I love your posts online. Listeners, please check below for both of Ed's accounts. But when you have Ed's field notes, it's always, or Ed's fever dreams, or Ed's, and these are raw, listeners. I know many of you are familiar, but for those who aren't, these are raw, powerful, very sincere revelations of either personal experiences, thoughts, dreams, intuitions that you have that come from this area. So my question would be, now that you're here, now that you're connecting all these dots, and what I would say is you're really tracing out the techniques of La Santa. What has your recent journey into the history of La Santa, what has that done to enhance your quest for redemption? What has it done to enhance your sincerity as you approach Lasanta? Like, how has it changed, or has it altered how you think about redemption and inspiring others and serving others?
yeah,
Yeah.
I have I started my relationship with her um, in a very complex way. She was always around. It was always like a family thing, but there was no real like specific thing, like a specific practice around her. And then I went to work for the police, and it was introduced to me as a thing to be feared, or as a thing that if I was in leagues with, it would make me somebody to be feared. So it was in that way, it was, I don't know, it's difficult to process, I guess. And I'm still kind of battling with that. Um, the my brothers, the people that I work with, the people that I bled and cried, and some of them are not here with me anymore, that I was working with, shared the same veneration. And I think that allowed me to go through some of the aspects of the life that I had to go through. They have this, one of the fever dreams I write about this letter I got from a friend of mine who kind of withered away, um, asking me to talk to his daughter, which is a weird petition to have. Uh, he was a guy that was active with us for a long period. He went into alcohol, drugs, and he got on the take with one cartel or another, and he basically got murdered at work. Um, he was a he was of the faith, and he asked me that if anything happened, to please talk to her daughter about him, because I he said you got to see the best of me, and she's probably not going to see that. So just talk to her. Can you talk to her about it? Um, I did. She didn't want to speak to me, but I wrote her a letter, and I've shared that letter a few times online. And in that letter, I say, I prayed to La Santa to send me somebody that could guide me through this darkness. And instead of an angel, she sent me a devil. And that's your dad. Your
Oh,
dad showed me who not to trust, showed me who to trust, showed me who. showed me where not to go, showed me who not to speak to. And everything he taught me was because those are sins he committed. And he was trying to keep me from committing the same sins myself. And
Yeah.
when I gave that to her, I think I saved some of him. Um, while I move forward in my own process, figuring things out, I want somebody to make that same letter at some point for my kid if anything happens, or and something will again, where it's all inevitable. Um, but as I'm going through my process of like healing, sobriety, one thing they don't tell you about this healing process is it's lonely as fuck. You can't
Mm.
do this process and have a relationship or like figure things out with somebody else. This is true believer territory. So for me, it's been a few years. Um, when you're going through this whole process of healing and trying to figure things out, and the constant relationship that I've had with La Santa as I go through my process from being not so public with it to now being very public with it. A lot of backlash, a lot of heat, a lot of Christians not understanding it, being kind of pretty non unchristian like towards me, and a lot of persecution that I've
Mm.
kind of like
Mm.
had around it. But that just makes it stronger, you know. That just makes the faith stronger within me, like because I know, at least for me, that whatever, I mean, you have to do a lot of mental gymnastics with a lot of deities, but death is pretty clear cut. It's a very
Yeah.
easy thing to have faith in. You can see it, you know, you can smell it. It's around. Um, I think now where I'm at with it and in my process is this whole aspect of, when I got sober, one of the things that I offered was to be very much more vocal and open with my faith, which is what I've been doing for the
Mm.
past few years. And I think where I'm at with it right now is at peace with what I lost and what I can't get back. You know, the inevitability of all of us basically losing our leaves as a tree.
Mm.
But now being able to basically say, hey, a lot of this stuff worked for me. This aspect of my faith practice worked for me. This is what it is. It's not something mysterious or secret or hidden. This is what it is. And sharing it publicly with the people has been great. And again, the whole aspect of just passing it on, um, having somebody else write a similar letter than I wrote at some point about me. I think that's a good goal to have. And paying it back. You know, I went through a very difficult time in my life, and I did a lot of things that were very difficult, and some of them were not so positive. So now I'm on the other side of it, and I'm trying to change the color from black to red right now. You know,
The loneliness that you describe, the silent battles that you fight, I can say this in your decision to go public. I know that you sharing about your loneliness has, because I've heard from people, has made people a lot less lonely. I can say that. I'm sure you hear from all kinds of people sharing that, but I've also heard from listeners that, wow, I didn't like one after our first podcast, one person said, I didn't have words to describe the pain that I was feeling, but Ed said it really well. And then another person after the second was like, I didn't realize that the same thoughts that I was having every day and the challenges I had, that Ed really expressed it. Oh my gosh, I'm not alone. So do you feel that too, that it is, I mean, there's right, nobody can be inside someone else's head. The battles you fight are so silent. You have to be so tough. But do you hear from people who share that you
yeah,
are inspired, which
yeah.
is just that's so great.
I get people messaging me around specific things that they caught, and or yeah, the whole aspect of I always tell people like group, if you're gonna go to therapy, include group therapy in there at some point. And it's not
Uh-huh.
about comparing your pain but just being able to hear somebody else's, world. ending event makes your apocalypse not that hard, I guess. Uh,
Mm.
it's hard to feel down on yourself because of alcoholism, PTSD, divorce, losing all the people that I lost, and just being having to basically reinvent myself. It's hard to be down on myself when you're sitting in a room in a group therapy session and a woman is talking about raising a son that she had after she was raped, you know. Now I look at her when she was talking about that experience and I'm like, my pain just disappears. It just
Oh,
like, where is it? You know?
yeah.
And it's been something that I've kind of realized as far as even in devotional practices. When the times I've gone to the Pito, for example, or some of the times that I've gone to some of these public altars and engaged with people there and asked questions. I was in Arizona at the our mission Santa Muerte altar, which I think it's closed now, but when it was still open,
Mm.
um, uh, they were great. I would show up there at 12 midnight and they would just let me in. I I have this practice that I learned, and I'll smoke 7 cigarettes in front of the effigy as I have this conversation with it. It's a
Mm.
sacrifice. 7 cigarettes. They'll cut your lifetime down a bit, probably. So there's a sacrifice there.
Mm. Yes.
Um, and as I'm sitting there smoking with an effigy of death in the middle of Arizona, um, somebody comes up and sits next to me and asks me questions about why and why the cigarettes, why this and why midnight and why is this so important? And they start sharing some of the aspects of their trauma and their pain, and we just start talking there in
Mm.
this devotional space. Um, the the ability to be able to be bold and brave and just be open. That's what comes with an open relationship to death and having a very, very well thought out relationship with finality. I think it just makes you want to talk to people. It just makes you appreciate things a bit better, and it just makes you open. Um, that's like not everybody has that same relationship, I guess, but that's what I've encountered with some of the older practitioners and some of the practitioners that I've called now teachers and some of the guardians that I've encountered. This whole aspect of service as part of the faith, hearing people out, sharing your history. There's a lady in one of the altars in Mexico City that goes around and gives out coffee and tamales to people for free. I mean, this is a beautiful thing to see uh,
Oh,
with this giant Santa Muerte effigy on the back of her moped.
that.
It's fucking phenomenal to see. Um, and I think that's what's missing in a lot of the modern devotional stuff that I'm seeing in the US is that lack of service. It's
Mhm.
all kind of narcissistic and self-indulgent. Where like, yeah, she's gonna give me this and she protects me and she does this for me.
Mm.
But what are you doing for her? And again, I've talked about the ways that I do offerings. I mean, I offer to life because that's the other side of her.
Yeah.
This whole image of her being at the steps of the ladder to heaven is like this recurring theme that I get. And when you get there, the your only receipts are going to be in life. And what receipts do you have? You know, I think that's another aspect of it that kind of switches from Catholicism and Christianity, where it's like your receipts are going to be up there in heaven. With us, there's more of a thought process of receipts being in life. Like what are you doing for the people around you? Like who's going to be setting up candles for you during Day of the Dead? How much food is going to be placed on your side of the ancestor altar? I mean, your receipts are going to be in life. Who's going to write a letter to your kid? And
Right.
that aspect of it, I think, is deep within some of the expectations of a practitioner. At least those were there for me when I was coming up. Like, hey, this is a faith, yeah, but what are you like? What are you going to do for her? You know, and for me, it was at the start to keep my people safe, keep my guys safe, keep them going, and not die. And now it's turned into making all of that experience somehow a positive because it was a negative for me. So, and also the receipt aspect of it, you know, when I get to the stairs, when I get to the steps of that ladder, and she like, hey, let me see your receipts, you know. Now,
Hmm.
what is she gonna see behind me in life?
Hmm.
That's pretty much it at a deep kind of like spiritual level and as a faith practice. And on some of the at that mystical side, it's kind of very hard to source and get to, and kind of elusive, specifically around Santa Muerte, and more so now because a lot of these people are passing away and dying or moving on. Or um, I think that's kind of the element that I see uh, pop up over and over again, an early element within the faith, and now as it is as with me through me. That's what I that's what I've been keeping going as far as practice.
Yeah, that's been one of the big themes that you've just shared today is the amazing connections, the preservation of the history. And I was chatting with Laura Davila, right? Daphne Leche Sera, and talking about preserving the tradition of specific practices. And I think you are nobody that I've ever seen has traced the history. I mean, from the Hidalgo region from 200 years ago, all the way through the church acceptance with the altars to the Zacatecas, the mining community, the breaking, the migration to Mexico City, the addition of things, the inclusion of these new traditions that are coming in, all the way to the 2000s, and now this split. You are tracing out so many techniques and so many touch points that I think nobody's really talked about before. I mean, this is you're the first person I think to really trace this out. Let me ask you this. Do you see with the split, we don't know where it's going to go, but do you see the split over the years between these two groups getting more and more pronounced? Do you see any crossover back, or do you think it's just going to be more of that with TikTok and everything else?
I think yeah, TikTok is very important with this, like social media as a whole,
Yeah.
because that's the dispersion element now. Um, I think uh, I think even within TikTok, you're seeing that schism, right? They're going back and forth
Yeah.
on TikTok and stuff like that already. Um, I think I think uh, I think one of the things that's going to be very important is to be able to call out or see things now as we kind of move forward into its public forum,
Hmm.
and also into the we have to somehow, if you're a practitioner out there, if you have this faith practice that was inherited to you, if you have this as a spiritual center in your family or in your life, we have to think about conservation now, right?
Hmm.
Um, I always think back on early Christianity and its history and how fucking weird it is. You know, how Jesus was depicted with a wand and no beard and all these elements of Dionysus being, you know, all of the weird transmingling of pagan ritual into this. And it's kind of the same thing, only at a macro level, but it could be at a giant level later on in history.
Hmm.
But you see elements of that same thing happening here. And my whole effort is conservation. When I say
Hmm.
conservation, I mean if I see something, I recently found a Virgin Mary like venerational like image, and behind it there's a Santa Muerte prayer card stuck to it,
Ah,
and it's
wow.
I have it. You want to see it? Like
Oh
it's
my gosh. Yes, if
hold
you
on,
have it, that would,
hold on.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
This is a Purísima Concepción de María. This is from a sanctuary in San Lucas, Michoacán.
Wow, St. Lucas, Michoacan. Oh my goodness.
All right.
Yeah.
nothing out
Ooh,
of the ordinary, like
right?
a beautiful image.
Yes.
But then you turn it around and there's a Oración a la Santa Muerte with red candle wax stuck to the back of it.
Oh my goodness. Which goes exactly to what you're talking about with the Virgin of Guadalupe and the cloak of stars and the mirror image right on the back side. Oh my goodness, that is beautiful.
Yeah, it's basically just one of like a venerational item from this sanctuary. And at some point, somebody was saying, "Well, I'm gonna hedge my bets and bet on both sides." And
My goodness. It's
but
that,
like
yeah.
finding things like this, like people don't know what they're looking at, you know. And I I make it a point to like ask questions and see, and like I have pictures and references. And not a lot of people are obviously looking for stuff like that. I have an eye for it. But that's the type of stuff that I think should be preserved or conserved, you know.
Yeah.
If Santa Muerte turns into something completely different than in the next 100 years, I who knows? But if it uh, if it continues on its trajectory, I think it's a pretty good idea to have some of these things kind of preserved and saved. And just taking pictures of them and posting them online and just posting some of my notes for free for people to access and see. That's a big part of it, you know. I was working on a book for a while, and I'm still am, but I can't keep this stuff for myself. I need to share it because what if I get run over? I legit have this worry or urgency to kind of like post some of these things or share some of the things that I find because there's not a lot of people like me out there kind of looking at some of these stuff closely. There's not a lot of people out there that will venture into some of the places that I've had to venture into to kind of like see the secrets or see the history of or gain favor with this lady that is suspicious about everybody, and I have to give her a TV so she can talk to me about some of these things. You know, there's not a lot of people out there that have that methodology, I guess. And you know, there's a few other guys out there trying to figure some of this stuff out. And again, I mentioned Espiral Morado,
Hmm.
who's more into the esoteric and the spiritual side of this. He actually came out with his veneration devotional prayer, utilizing some of the videos that I post up of my altar, where she's basically invoking La Santa Muerte and La Virgen de Guadalupe in the same prayer, which is beautiful, which
Wow.
is more of an expression of what the spiritual mystical practices of it are evolving are like in a more formalized way outside of the public veneration aspect of it. You know, again, it's growing, it's evolving.
Hmm.
There are people within it involved in the mystical side of it. There are people in it involved in the witchcraft, the spell casting, and the utilizing it as a well, like spiritual weapon aspect of it.
Hmm.
And then there are people like me who have this faith presented to them from a young age, and they hold on to it across this
Yeah.
uh, interesting journey of life.
Yeah, I 100% see you as a devotee, of course, but also a historian, if I may, an archivist. I think one could say someone who is conserving that, who is preserving it. So even if in 100 years it totally changes and now it's all Luciferian, I don't know, I'm just making this up, but people can still go back and look at the original history, look at Hidalgo in the 1800s and the church records, and look at that evolution, you know?
Yeah. Just having something you can see like, oh, this is what they were doing. Oh, this is why they were doing this. This is where this comes from. Um, I imagine when it comes to like ritual magic as well, that's very important to know who you're invoking and why,
Yes.
and what the tools are for, and you know, knowing that your intention is where it needs to be. And it's important to have some of these things kind of there. And a lot of us, and I'll include people that are out there who are faithful, new to the faith. A lot of us are nebulous around the faith. A lot of us have assumptions or think that we know what it is, or we heard somebody talk about it, or we did an online course with somebody where we bought a book by this American guy who is now hated by most of the community in Mexico. Um, but basically, we have a lot of nebulous faith practitioners who are just like, is this it? Is this not it? Is this okay? Should I have this statue here? Should I not have this statue here? We're
Hmm.
basically kind of like stuck in this whole like it's not about the size of your altar or the statue there or like it's about your actions. Um it's about how you actually prove how you demonstrate your faith through your actions in your life. And also the aspect of just having a like a legit formalized relationship to death uh is I think that's at a core. And again, a lot of people that are coming into this faith are fascinated maybe by the iconography or interested in its occult side
Hmm.
uh, or just want to be a part of something bigger than themselves and enjoying joining this ginormous group of people out there who share in this faith practice. All of them are valid. For me, it's like I would advise all of them to take some time and actually trace back some of the reasons why things are the way they are, some of the
Hmm.
history. Um, I would quiet some of the voices that scream about decolonization of a faith practice,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
which is something that I keep hearing a lot. We're going to decolonize Santa Muerte as a faith practice is one of the most poisonous things that I've ever heard. When these practices were kept safe and guarded by women who were Catholic inside of a Catholic church and fought for this faith. Um, and when they and when this faith practice was kicked out of the church, Catholicism and Catholic faith practices and symbolism and ritual was a part of it and is
Mhm.
still a part of it. And if you go down to Mexico City for any of the festivities at this Santa Muerte Church or an altar, a Padre Nuestro is probably going to be recited before any invocation of Santa Muerte is going to be done. So, because that's the way it started. Now, does that mean it has to be that way for everybody? No, but it's a pretty good idea to know where things come from and reasons why things are the way they are. And instead of saying decolonize Santa Muerte, like probably understand it first. Uh, Getting rid of all the Catholic elements, Catholic ritual, and aspects of its concealed form is doing a disservice to your ancestors and to the people that kept this safe for years for you to be able to have it. So I think that's where I'm kind of like leaning towards as far as pushing on people like, hey, like look, it's time to look back a little bit before we get too far in the road. It's a 2 decades
Yeah.
old public faith. Let's look back before we lose sight of our origin.
Ed, that is truly such a powerful message, and I hope the listeners appreciate that. Let history speak for itself. Don't try and change the history. It's part of the history. I remember on the first podcast you mentioned that too. It's just it is what it is. This is the history that it emerged from. And Ed, as well, you might have just answered this question with developing a relationship with death and asking why things are the way they are. But we do have a few listener questions for you. And one of them is from Naomi C. Taranis. Naomi's great. And she says, Ed, thank you for sharing your knowledge. I really enjoyed the last episode that you were on. My question is this: if someone is being called by Santa Muerte and is new to knowledge about her, including all her different colors and aspects, what would be the best way to honor and respect La Santa as a whole? Thank you again, Naomi asks. So again, those basic, those key
Yeah,
things.
I think learning how to set up ritual space, which is something that's very universal. Um,
Hmm.
Learning ways of setting up ritual space and invocation that are very much Catholic in origin. And if
Hmm.
people are divorced or angry at the Catholic Church or think that they're, somehow supporting the Catholic Church by doing all these things, Daphne,
Mm.
Bruja de Rancho,
Yep.
she's a gangster. Like, and she's a gangster and she goes to church,
Yeah.
Doña Queta is a gangster and she goes to church. She goes to mass. Um, I'm not talking to I'm not asking anybody to convert to Catholicism, but there are there's a reason why legit Luciferian practitioners and Satanists basically utilize Catholic ritual as a basis of mockery to flip it. I mean, they themselves recognize the power that ritual has, and the fact that the Catholic Church has had pretty hardcore ritual practice and esoteric power for centuries, and there's something about that. But it's not necessarily owned by them. So being able to learn some of the basic practices of cleaning a candle, what type of candle, what the colors mean, cleaning a ritual space, what an offering looks like, what type of offerings does she take? And that's another aspect of this that people have added on to themselves. Like people have added on all sorts of different elements as far as a ritual offering for her. But classic ones are honey, cinnamon, apples, flowers. Um, Candles are usually white. There's usually a water vessel uh, somewhere on the altar. Some people have noticed that I have a wine glass full of water on a plate and I flip it over. So the water's basically flipped, and it remains inside of it. There's a few reasons why that is, and one of them is pretty funny. I remember asking one of my teachers, and she's like, "What's that about?" Oh, it's a way to keep the water clean, and it's because it's flipped upside down. But also she said,
Uh,
water is a medium, and it's a way to commune between worlds. Water.
mm,
Baptism is there's a reason why you get baptized in water, and there's a symbology in submersion, and having a water element on the altar specifically related to death and going to the other side is kind of like an essential thing. Um, Flowers, uh, and also realizing that even when flowers dry, decay is part of the offering. So like actually letting things dry on the altar and letting things kind of like perish on the altar is part of the practice, which again, these are things that I've heard multiple times from different practitioners and just seeing different types of altars out there in Mexico. Um, and finally, just things around the effigy itself. Uh, a lot of the effigies that we have now are loaded on the bottom. They're prepared, ritually prepared, or at least that's our assumption. And I've been to some of the places where they make some of these effigies. There's nothing special being done. Some of them are
ah,
being there's some of them are being stuffed with newspaper instead of the traditional plants that they put inside of it.
mm,
Some of them have Buddha figures on the bottom. Some of the older ones have Buddha figures on the bottom. There's no
mm,
reason other than the fact that that's all they had to put on the bottom of it to add to activate it. Um,
mm,
so you have to do that yourself. You have
mm,
to consecrate, activate, and bless this object yourself. And I'm not here to tell you how to do it. Everybody has a different way of doing it. But one thing I will tell you is running water is a key part of this, and rainwater. That's
mm.
the that's ways of cleaning and preparing these ritual items. The only mention that I've been able to find as far as anything astrological related to Santa Muerte in some of the older texts is the preparation of protection items or tools related to the moon. That's about
Mm,
it.
mm. Okay. That's perfect. And Ed, I'm taking a bunch of notes here. So Naomi, that's a great question. So honey, cinnamon, apples, flowers, white candles, upside down vessels, obviously flipping the water over death is and decay is actually a part of the offering. Running water or rainwater. These are so critical. And Ed, you just touched on this too. We have two astrology based questions for you from Clay Henry. And Clay is asking, for the first one, and I believe you just touched on this, but Clay's saying, according to at least archaeology, astrology and astronomy were important to the pueblos originarios de Mexico, the indigenous peoples of Mexico. You have spoken in the past, Ed, about the connections between modern day Santa Muerte and pre European indigenous practices. So Trey is asking, Does astrology, Ed, find its way into modern Santa Muerte? But you were saying, aside from the
No,
moon, no?
it's, aside from the moon aspect, I don't see that. Yes, it was a part of Mesoamerican like practices, pre-colonial practices, but this is a high level among the priest class and among the more educated class, and some of that didn't translate downwards.
Mm,
Um, and people didn't need to realize that when the Spanish came, they didn't kill all of the Mexica.
mhm,
Some of them actually came in and allied themselves with the Spanish after the conquest of Tennessee, after the conquest of the Mexica Empire. Um, and instead of going full extermination with them, they invited some of the nobility in, and they had an exchange of information.
mm, mhm,
So a lot of the early forms of spiritual practice in Mexico come from that interaction. Having some of their astronomers, of their priest class come in and share notes with some of the Franciscan monks, and basically saying, how can we meld what you believe in with what we believe in? And that's how you get the Virgin of Guadalupe imagery, That actually comes from conversations with some of the priestly class natives back then, where they're adding elements of their faith practice into this icon that was later transformed into the Virgen of Guadalupe iconography. So, as far as Santa Muerte as a whole goes, yeah, you'll see a lot of witchcraft books where they infuse astrology in there, or a lot of people that have taken that faith as far as a basis for their ritual practice and stuff like that, where you see a lot of it. As far as any sort of indication of it and the folk practice around it, the only thing I've seen mentioned is the moon being very essential for preparation of tools, altar spaces, or anything protection related. That's protection for yourself, for your home, for the altar itself. So if you have a San Miguel Arcangel, I guess that would be something to consider as considered a protection element. If you have I have garlic across the front of my altar on the ground, and that gets placed on during a full moon. Water gets changed if it's covered. Usually, when it gets dirty or milky during the full moon. So that's the only astrological element that been managed to kind of pick up on my end. There might be more out there. I just haven't been able to see it myself.
Gotcha. No, that's super great context. Thank you for sharing that. And the last question from Trey, and then I definitely want to chat about your final big takeaways for listeners, what you want to leave them with. But the last question from Trey Henry is, how do you, Ed, personally feel about astrology? Does it factor into your own practices at all, or no?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I look at the stars. I look at symbolism. I look at a big part of the mystical side of this, and when you see it practiced amongst some of the older people, and I do this as well, is seeing patterns in nature, seeing numerology pop up and stuff like that. They'll look at images that pop up in dreams, and see if it's a way that she's basically communicating with you, or if you're asking for something, if you could see it expressed out there. Uh, and astrology is like it's everywhere in Mexico, and it gets infused into a lot of these things. You get asked about your birth sign, and if that's that, like it's like a thing here culturally, but not specifically related to Santa Muerte in any way, really. I personally I believe in some of that. Me and my daughter are both Leos, and you can tell. uh,
Yep, yep.
but I don't know. I haven't delved that much into it myself. But it's definitely something that's present there. Most people that are practicing it in Mexico or have some of that in their, they'll stop and read the astrology page on the in the newspaper. And I personally believe that there's something to it. I've had my charts read and done a few times by a few people, and they're scary
Yeah.
as far they're scary as far as how as I was telling them the same thing. Man, I wish I could have had this when I was like 12. It prepared me for some shit.
Well, Ed, that's awesome context. Again, I think listeners can really draw some powerful lessons from you there. Ed, as we wrap up the podcast here, you have taken us on an amazing journey because you are connecting so many dots from Hidalgo to the mountainous regions of Zacatecas to with silver mines to Mexico City to Doña Queta and the Tepito Barrio to, to the United States to Connecticut. You've even taken us to Connecticut. As we wrap up the podcast, what are some of the big takeaways or some of the things that you would just like to leave listeners with as they investigate Santa Muerte, as maybe they're struggling with their own seeking of redemption? What are some of the big things that you want to leave them with?
There's nobody owns this faith. It is coming from lower, desperate, low means people. It's miners that are going into a hole where they might not come out of. When it went to Tepito, it was some of the people that lived there, criminals, some of them, not all of them. Uh, Mothers who couldn't get, women who couldn't get pregnant, people in the trans community that were persecuted more openly in the past. People like myself who were working for the government in a dangerous job that was already uh, vilified. You know, um, this is who it comes from, or this is who kind of keeps it or has kept it alive till now. Um, so adding any sort of monetary value to things or making things expensive or like fancy or ginormous is mostly about the ego of the practitioner and not about the faith itself. Death isn't hungry. You know, realistically, she doesn't want a big fancy house. Uh, she's these are all things we do for ourselves and our community. So figure out a way to first realize that death, there's no way of paying her off. When it's your time, it's your time. There's no negotiating that, Um, but there is getting peace with it. There is getting to know it, and there is forming a relationship with it. Focus more on that first, rather than the whole materialistic side of it, where people want to buy, construct, and make these sometimes these altars for their own ego instead of like a working altar, like an actual sacred space where you can have a conversation in an open area with this energy, a spirit, um, whatever you want to call it. I just call it death because that's who she is, right? And it's a she because there's no way death can be death without being able to give life. So it's probably a she. So focus on that first. Uh, don't let history die. Look back before you look forward. It's very essential and very important, I think. Or else this whole aspect of walking blind into the future backwards. Um, a friend of mine told me about ancestor veneration, that all of us are walking backwards into the future, and all we have is the faces of our ancestors to guide us. And that's an interesting way of looking at it. Um, I've had multiple occasions when some of the ways that I was doing my faith practice made sense. I was like, oh, that's why this is the way it is, right?
Mm.
Um, from stick candles versus glass candles, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the glass candles will remain lit in public spaces. And that's the reason why most of the ones that you'll see on public altars are glass. There's no other reason behind it. It's just like it's because they stay lit for longer, right? Um, it's logical, and it kind of provides you with this weird relationship to people in the past that have kind of done some of these things. Realizing that there's rosary seeds on the bottom, these red rosary seeds at the bottom of these Santa Muerte effigies, specifically the ones from the early 2000s.
Mm.
And you're like, why are those there? Well, if somebody drills into them and it becomes dust, it is one of the most toxic elements on the planet. So it's actually there to keep people from fucking with your effigy and breaking it. So it's not only an actual protection ritual underneath it, it's a biological weapon too. Um,
Mm.
so all of these things you start finding like, why wasn't I told this? Like, why wasn't I shown this? And you are, and your ancestors are communicating through these objects, through these elements of faith, through time to you. Like when you realize some of these things, it's a pretty good idea to kind of learn something about that, the history about some of these things. Nobody owns that. You can do it yourself. You can do it freely. Um, I'm sad to say that I have no book to recommend except this one. It's in Spanish, but it's an interesting little insight into the faith practices of early. I haven't been able to find any other book on the subject that kind of goes into detail like I've have in this in our conversations. I'm working on something myself, but it's like I haven't. This is all new territory to me. I'm still trying to figure out some of these things. Figuring out provenance or some of the objects that I have. Figuring out a little bit of finding people that are from different backgrounds than I am, that know more about the ritualistic side of some of these things that I don't, and kind of getting their take on some of these things to see if they could provide some insight. It's a process, but it's something I'm doing kind of gladly.
Yeah. Well, Ed, we are so honored that you are sharing these updates with us. I know myself and the so many listeners will very, very much appreciate it. And we'll also keep our ear to the ground for any updates on your any further research, insights, your future book. Um, Listening to you today reminded me of the quote from Hemingway, which is, "The world breaks everyone, but afterwards, many are strong in the broken places." And you are someone, a delver into the darkness, a seeker and finder of redemption, someone who fights and inspires people all over the world, and someone who is a venerator of La Santa Muerte, Ed Calderon. Ed, thank you so much just for taking that time generously and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today. It is always such an honor, really.
Thank you for giving me this platform and the space to talk about this obscure subject that is very near and dear to my heart. And may La Santa bless you and all of your listeners.